Conflict and peacemaking. This chapter began with an account of the Rwandan genocide, a story that seems to repeat itself with discouraging regularity in human history. In the aftermath of that genocide, Rwandans went through a process of reconciliation, following principles similar to those used in post-apartheid South Africa to help blacks and whites move beyond a history of oppression and violence to a more just, peaceful society. In Rwanda, formal court proceedings convicted several leaders of the genocide. In informal truth and reconciliation gatherings in Rwandan villages, Hutu perpetrators apologized to the relatives of their victims, who were given a public arena to air their rage. By most accounts, Rwanda is today a stable and peaceful society. Although tensions and bitterness persist, levels of aggression and conflict between the Hutus and Tutsis are low. What does social psychology have to say about transitions between conflict and reconciliation? Some empirically tested insights point to the power of construal as a source of both conflict and peacemaking. Misperception and polarization. The frenzied rush toward genocide in Rwanda was stirred by a manifesto known as the Hutu 10 Commandments, which was published in a widely read newspaper, the Kingura, and broadcast by local radio stations. The Hutu 10 Commandments warned of the threat posed by the Tutsis, insisting that Tutsi women were secret agents bent on Hutu demise, that Hutu men who married or employed Tutsi women were traitors, and that Hutus who did business with a Tutsi were enemies of the Hutu people. These and other rumors and fears led Hutus to form deadly misperceptions about the Tutsis that helped fuel the genocide. Such misperceptions of another group, often of a dehumanizing nature, are commonly promoted in wartime propaganda and in the rhetoric that accompanies international crises and serve to readily justify aggression. This is why so many people were so concerned about efforts by the Trump administration to collect and publicize a weekly list of crimes committed by immigrants in the United States, 2017. Efforts such as these encourage the tendency on the part of adversaries to see their conflict as a fight between good and evil. They come to think of their own group as moral and good and the other side as immoral and evil. Adversaries routinely assume that their opponent's interests are the exact opposite of their own, such that any gain for one side means a loss for the other. In the political arena, opposing partisans will tend to see their party as patriotic and their opponents as lacking in this virtue. These kinds of construals can lead to two problematic outcomes that fuel social conflict. First, they lead people to believe that conflicts are polarized, that on all sorts of issues people fall into one of two opposing camps. This tendency causes people to overlook the common ground they so often share. Lee Ross and his colleagues surveyed people on opposite sides of ideological conflicts over such issues as abortion and the death penalty, as well as enemies embroiled in geopolitical conflicts like those in Northern Ireland and the Middle East, 1995. The researchers had members of both sides report on their own attitudes and estimate the attitudes of their opponents, 1995. They found that group members systematically overestimated the extremity of their opponents' attitudes. That is, they assumed that the other side was made up of fanatical extremists and that the conflict was very polarized, when in fact, many people on the other side were more moderate in their convictions. Given this tendency, it should not come as a surprise that survey data from the past 30 years consistently find that people in the United States overestimate the differences between Republicans and Democrats, 2015. This tendency to polarize is particularly true for people who hold more extreme political views and is particularly salient when disputes are framed as conflicts between opposing groups. The media have become more polarized as well, as evident in the rise of negative media campaigns during elections and the move away from news shows that cover both sides of an issue to cable shows that masquerade as news programs, but in reality are opinion shows that advocate one ideological perspective. The second problematic outcome that misconstruals of one's opponents can lead to is a bias known as reactive devaluation, the tendency of opposing sides in a dispute to attach little value to any offer made by their counterpart in a negotiation. The mere fact that the other side makes a concession is enough to reduce the attractiveness of the proposal. 1991. In other words, you're my enemy, so if you made this proposal, it must not be in my interest or morally sound. To explore this tendency, researchers measured student protesters' attitudes about their university's proposal, about its investments in companies doing business in South Africa during the height of student protests against apartheid in the 1980s. Before the university adopted the plan, when students were considering its merits in the abstract, the students felt it was a significant and positive move, but after the plan was adopted and it was no longer an abstract proposal, students evaluated it much less favorably. The mere fact that the other side, the university administration, was known to have adopted the plan was enough to make students regard it with suspicion. When parties to a conflict react in this way, it can be difficult indeed to reach a satisfactory resolution. Reactive de-evaluation. Attaching less value to an offer in a negotiation once the opposing group makes it. Simplistic reasoning and rhetoric. In the heat of conflict, group members are prone to misperceive their opponent's intentions and to distrust their actions and proposed resolutions, rather than think about them in a nuanced way. Psychologist Phil Tetlock, 1981, has found that this kind of simplistic reasoning is reflected in simplistic rhetoric as well, which in turn can escalate conflicts. Tetlock notes that adversaries can reason and speak to each other in either a relatively complex fashion or a simple fashion. The complexity or simplicity of a position in a conflict is defined by two qualities. 1. The level of differentiation, or the number of principles and arguments in the position, and 2. The level of integration, or the connections drawn between the different principles and arguments. Those taking complex positions in conflicts consider many arguments and principles, even opposing ones, and draw many connections between them. Simpler positions involve fewer arguments, very few arguments from the other side especially, and few connections between the arguments and information being considered. For example, a complex position either for or against single-payer healthcare would involve many principles, such as ideas about the right to healthcare and a commitment to preventive care, as well as many factual arguments, such as healthcare savings, income tax consequences of single-payer coverage, and consideration of other countries that have single-payer coverage. A complex position on this issue would also include various connections between these principles and arguments, such as how single-payer coverage would influence the market and availability of qualified doctors. On the other hand, a simple position either for or against single-payer healthcare might be that it should be accepted in order to honor the fundamental right to healthcare, or that it is unacceptable for the government to control a realm of society that free markets are better suited to address. How does the complexity or simplicity of reasoning influence group conflict? To answer this question, Tetlock and his colleagues coded the complexity of politicians' reasoning from their speeches and interviews, 1981. They found that politicians are more simplistic and extreme when combating opponents and wooing political voters on the campaign trail, but then become more complex once elected when dealing with the give and take of policy making. In another study, researchers examined the complexity of political leaders' rhetoric during two crises, the build-up to World War I in 1914 and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, in which U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev averted a nuclear encounter. Figure 13.6 shows that between the preliminary phase of the conflict and the climax that led to World War I, the complexity of the political leaders' rhetoric decreased. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was successfully resolved, the complexity of the leaders' rhetoric increased between the preliminary phase of the conflict and the climax. Figure 13.6, Conflict and the complexity of rhetoric. In international crises, leaders who speak in ways that are more complex, taking into consideration the other side's views, are more likely to avoid escalating conflicts. Okay, so this is a side-by-side bar graph. On the x-axis, the two categories are World War I and Cuban Missile Crisis, and on the y-axis is leaders' complexity of rhetoric from 0 to 6, and the two sets of bars are preliminary phase and climax. So you can see in World War I, considering the preliminary phase, the complexity of rhetoric is 2.15, and by the time of the climax, the rhetoric complexity is 1.96, so it has slightly decreased. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the preliminary phase complexity of rhetoric is 4.01, and by the time of the climax, the complexity of the rhetoric of the leaders has increased to 5.42, about 1.5, showing they will have averted the disaster because they've increased the complexity of their rhetoric, which they did. You campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. Mario Cuomo, former governor of New York. Box 13.6, focus on culture, moral murders. Ellen Fisk and Taj Ray, in their book Virtuous Violence, have gone so far as to say that most murders are committed by people who feel they're acting morally. 2014. The perpetrators feel that what they're doing is just and right. Hundreds of thousands of European Protestants were killed by Catholics to end what Catholics believed was a heresy that presented a mortal challenge to the true faith. Hundreds of thousands of Catholics were murdered by Protestants to rid the world of people who willingly supported what Protestants thought of as a manifestly evil institution. The Nazis' killing of Jews was carried out in service to a moral obligation to rid the country of vermin who had been deliberately undermining the fatherland for decades. Stalin killed millions of Russians because they were venal capitalists blocking the path to a communist utopia. Mao Zedong and Pol Pot killed untold numbers of their compatriots in China and Cambodia, respectively, for the same reason. Most family feuds and tribal conflicts are seen by their participants as having moral motives. We must defend the family honor. They killed one of ours. It would be cowardly and wrong not to kill one of theirs. As blood feuds. Many more soldiers have fought for love of tribe or country than for bloodlust. Loyalists of ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, behead enemies in service to what they see as the moral obligation to hasten the coming of the world Salafate. Even the murder of one person by another over a quarrel or a perceived injustice can be rationalized by a spirit of self-righteousness. The victim deserved to die because of what he did to me. Members of a group will sometimes kill one of their own because of transgressions against the group's moral code, as in stonings for adultery or stranglings for slander. None of this implies that such actions are objectively moral, but rather that the actors subjectively feel that their behavior will make the world a better place. Fisk and Ray maintain that if we fail to recognize the self-perceived morality of people who are willing to kill on a massive scale, we're likely to misunderstand their motives and make serious mistakes in our conduct toward them. For example, governments often assume that if they simply build a strong enough war machine, they'll defeat insurgents fighting in what they believe is a sacred cause. Such insurgent groups have been known to shock their enemies by winning the day against a force 10 times larger than their own, something they're able to pull off because of the great moral commitment and fervor they have for their cause. Mass killings throughout history. Queen Mary of England, who earned the nickname Bloody Mary, restored Catholicism in England and during her reign executed numerous Protestants, including these 10 Protestant martyrs portrayed in this etching. So you can see people being burned at the stake, alive. Communication and reconciliation. Often in the heat of conflict or in the aftermath of aggression, adversaries stop communicating and separate from one another. Politicians fighting over a budget deal hunker down with their own party, formulating strategy intended to cut their opponents out of the deal. Warring nations expel diplomats and end formal communication. In divorce proceedings, the husband and wife are told not to communicate with each other, no matter how benign their intentions. Moreover, in today's world of websites, talk shows, cable TV, and news sharing on social media platforms, people all too readily become immersed in echo chambers of opinion populated by like-minded individuals. As a result of these tendencies, adversaries are less likely to look at issues from perspectives other than their own, How do we get out of our cultural bubbles and counteract these isolationist trends? One solution is to actively imagine other people's perspectives, to document the benefits of taking different perspectives on social conflict. Ethan Cross and Igor Grossman, 2012, had student participants talk about two heated political issues and what the future would look like if their preferred candidate in the 2008 U.S. presidential election, McCain versus Obama, were to lose. They did so after being instructed either to immerse themselves in their own point of view, as people so often do during conflict, or to reflect on this political future from the perspective of someone in Iceland, thus taking on an outsider's view of the polarizing political issues of the day. Participants who looked at the conflicts of the day from a different, more distant perspective were more likely to humbly recognize the limitations of their own knowledge, were more convinced that the conflicts of the day would change, reported less extreme attitudes, and were more likely to join a bipartisan political discussion group that brought together students of contrasting political views. The tendency to avoid adversaries and immerse oneself only in one's own perspective also flies in the face of a potent tool for reducing conflict, face-to-face communication, 1998. Numerous empirical studies find that simply allowing adversaries to communicate reduces levels of competition and aggression and increases the chances of finding satisfying resolutions to many kinds of conflict, 2005. Communication helps reduce the misperceptions of opponents and paves the way for peacemaking and cooperation. As adversaries communicate, they often show a powerful tendency to reconcile, to make amends for hurtful words and harmful acts, and to return to more peaceful relations. Though we tend to avoid communication with adversaries, reconciliation is in our nature as well. Even our primate relatives exhibit instinctual tendencies toward reconciliation, 1996. For example, in the heat of conflict, chimpanzees display submissive postures and vocalizations, actions that trigger conciliation behaviors such as grooming, open-handed gestures, and even embraces. Humans resort to more complex reconciliation behaviors, confessions, apologies, signs of remorse, that may trigger forgiveness, leading to reduced feelings of revenge and increased acceptance of the other person, 2008. The Camp David Peace Accords. Although the communication in 1978 was painful and filled with conflict, it led to a lasting peace between Israel and Egypt. Shown here are U.S. President Jimmy Carter in center, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. So all three of them are looking at each other. They're forming a triangle and holding hands and smiling in the front of a press conference, it looks like. Studies of reconciliation by social psychologists have led to an innovative approach adopted by the criminal justice system in the United States, Australia, and other countries, 2008. In many jurisdictions, the perpetrator and victim of crimes are usually separated, often for very good reason, and denied any opportunity to communicate and reconcile. As an alternative to this approach, in programs focused on restorative justice, professionals who are trained in both counseling and the law mediate conversations between perpetrators and victims. The offender takes responsibility for the crime, something the offender often resists confessing to in a courtroom. The offender tries to undo the crime through apology, acts of reparation, or both, and the offender and victim are encouraged to engage in a respectful dialogue. As difficult as these conversations may sound, they are often highly effective. Victims of crime who participate in restorative justice programs report many fewer thoughts of revenge than comparison individuals do, and they're more than twice as likely to forgive the offender and say that the criminal justice system is fair. 2007. A picture of reconciliation. This conciliatory photograph shows Jean-Pierre Carenzi, a perpetrator, and Vivienne Niramana, a survivor of the Rwandan genocide, 20 years later. They express their feelings in the following statements. Carenzi: my conscience was not quiet, and when I would see her I was very ashamed. After being trained about unity and reconciliation, I went to her house and asked for forgiveness. Then I shook her hand. So far, we are on good terms. Niramana: he killed my father and 3 brothers. He did these killings with other people, but he came alone to me and asked for pardon. He and a group of other offenders who had been in prison helped me build a house with a covered roof. I was afraid of him. Now I have granted him pardon. Things have become normal, and in my mind I feel clear. Moving toward a less violent world, we began this chapter by pointing out that people the world over have witnessed horrific levels of violence in the past 100 years in the form of wars and genocides. But despite the dispiriting news we hear daily, psychologist Steven Pinker has offered a very different perspective on our current times. 2007. He argues that we are enjoying one of the least aggressive, most cooperative periods in human history. The data he draws on to make his claim are broad in scope. For example, people are dramatically less likely to die in today's wars as opposed to those in the past. Gone are the days in Europe when soldiers marched to their death in orderly rows, stepping over the bodies of comrades in previous rows mowed down by musket and cannon fire. Murder rates have also fallen precipitously in every European culture that has been analyzed, as well as former European colonies in the Western and Southern hemispheres. In 15th century England, the 1400s, the annual murder rate was 24 per 100,000 people. In 1960 England, it was 0.6 per 100,000. The enhanced interrogation techniques used by the United States at various times since the 9/11 terrorist attacks have drawn criticism from many quarters, but several hundred years ago, much more brutal torture was the norm, and it was often a form of public entertainment. Enhanced interrogation in the Spanish Inquisition often meant breaking every bone in the suspected heretic's body with iron bars or roasting him slowly in an oven in the shape of a bull. How do we explain such broad cultural shifts in violence and today's more humane treatment of our foes? Pinker believes that the printing press and video camera have played a role. If everyone can read, everyone can be exposed to arguments against war and violence. Literacy and numeracy have made us smarter. 1987, and in general, more intelligent people will choose to handle their conflicts without violence. Images of the horrors of genocide and the devastation wrought by modern weaponry can lead to a revulsion that can chill the march to war. Armed conflict has come to seem an obviously terrible solution to any problem. The world has become substantially more interconnected. Our interests are more intertwined with those of people from other communities and nations. Globalization has made businesses multinational. Solutions to climate change and many other environmental problems will require treaties that involve many countries. Many college campuses in the United States and Canada draw students from all over the world. People communicate with others in distant lands over the internet, especially on social media platforms and through Skype. People are much more likely to marry and form friendships with people from different backgrounds. This expanding interdependence has given rise to greater cooperation among nations, states, and communities. 2000. Cooperation, Pinker argues, has short-circuited our more aggressive tendencies, thereby leading to behavior that is more pro-social. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. Shakespeare, The Merchant of Venice. Looking back, several construal biases, including dehumanization, misperceiving common ground, and simplistic reasoning and rhetoric, can escalate group conflict. Reconciliation processes can be a powerful tool for increasing peacemaking tendencies during and in the aftermath of conflict. Chapter Review Summary. Situational determinants of aggression. Hostile aggression is motivated by anger and hostility and has the primary aim of harming others, either physically or psychologically. Instrumental aggression is behavior intended to harm others to achieve a goal. Hot weather affects levels of aggressive behavior and violence. Hotter cities have higher rates of violent crime, and more violence occurs during hot months than during cool months. Media violence has been shown to promote aggressive acts in real life. Watching violent TV shows can lead to more aggressive behaviors in the short run, as can playing violent video games. Social rejection and isolation are powerful triggers of aggressive tendencies. Income inequality at the level of nation, state, county, neighborhood, and social context strongly predicts aggression of just about every kind. Construal processes and aggression. Anger-related thoughts of blame and revenge, as well as patterns of fight or flight responses, make people more likely to respond aggressively when prompted by cues, such as the presence of weapons. Extreme forms of violence, such as genocide and rape, are often accompanied by dehumanization, in which people deny others their basic human nature and the unique attributes that differentiate humans from other things. Group loyalty also predicts increases in dehumanization. People can modify their tendencies toward anger, dehumanization, and aggression by looking at frustrating issues or conflicts from a distance. Culture and aggression. People in some cultures, including the U.S. South, are especially likely to adhere to a culture of honor. They are inclined to respond to insults and actions that convey malicious intent with violence or threats of violence. Such cultures exist where there is a history of hurting, with the associated risks of losing all wealth. In rape-prone cultures, levels of violence tend to be high in general, and rape is used as a weapon in battle. Rape is also used as a ritual act and as a threat to keep women subservient to men. Cultures with fewer incidences of rape tend to grant women equal status. Evolution and aggression. Evolutionary theory provides a perspective on family violence, such as stepchildren being more subject to abuse than genetic offspring, who can carry on the genetic line. Violent and aggressive actions are generally committed by men more than women. Women are more likely to resort to relational aggression, such as gossip and ostracism, to hurt others emotionally. The evolutionary perspective explains that men are more likely to harm other men than women harm women because they face a fiercer competition for mates. In a recent synthesis of evolutionary and cultural approaches to male violence, researchers have proposed the precarious manhood hypothesis. A man's gender identity is variable and vulnerable, which makes men more reactive to threats to their identity and more likely to behave aggressively to prove their manhood. Conflict and peacemaking. Groups in conflict tend to misperceive the other side as extremist, and social conflicts are polarized. They believe their own side is moral and reactively devalue concessions of the other side. Complex reasoning involving more evidence and integration of ideas than simplistic reasoning promotes peacemaking in international conflicts. Getting distance to one's own views, as well as communication and reconciliation, are powerful ways to reduce conflict.